This is about Claude, a daily digest of news and discourse about the AI I keep coming back to. Whether you're a budding power user or merely Claude curious, we aim to keep you informed and help you make sense of where Claude is headed. It's the end of the week, and I want to start with a number. 1 in 25. On the world's largest code platform, tens of millions of developers, billions of lines of code, pull requests and commits pushed every hour of every day. One commit in every 25 is now written by Claude Code, not suggested by Claude Code, not assisted by Claude Code, written by it, submitted, merged, part of the permanent record of how software was built in February 2026. That figure doubled in a single month. At the current rate of growth, analysts project it will pass 1 in 5 by the end of this year. I've been sitting with that number all week, trying to work out why it lands the way it does. It's not the size of it. 4% is not, on its face, a dramatic figure. It's something else. It's the feeling that this was always there to be seen, and that seeing it clearly is harder than it should be. That's what I want to explore today. Not the number itself, but what it takes to look at it honestly. And why, even when we're paying attention, some things stay just out of focus. The figure comes from SemiAnalysis, a semiconductor and AI research firm, who published their analysis earlier this month under a headline that's been bouncing around developer circles ever since. Their thesis, Claude Code, is the inflection point, not for AI coding assistants, for AI agents generally. A proof of concept, running in production, at scale, measurable on a public platform anyone can watch. Claude Code is worth describing precisely, because what it actually does is different enough from what came before that the distinction matters. It isn't a co-pilot sitting in your editor suggesting the next line. It's a terminal native agent. You give it an objective. Refactor this module, fix this class of bug across the codebase, build this feature to this specification, and it reads the relevant files, forms a plan, executes changes across multiple directories, runs tests, interprets the errors, and iterates. The human's job, in that workflow, is to communicate the goal and review the result. The writing, in the conventional sense, happens in between. The growth curve is difficult to describe without it sounding like the kind of thing people say about everything. But 42,896 times more usage in 13 months since the research preview. A dramatic inflection in October 2025, followed by another surge in January 2026 after a single post on X from Boris Cherny, the Anthropic engineer who leads Claude Code, attracted 4.4 million views. That post is worth noting. Cherny wrote that for 2 consecutive months, 100% of his code had been written by Claude. Not most of it. Not the routine parts, all of it. He shipped 22 pull requests in a single day, each one AI authored. He described the experience not as automation, but as a change in what his job is. From writing to directing, from execution to judgment. This went viral, and then the commits kept coming. SemiAnalysis's framing for all of this is the one that stuck. While you blinked, AI consumed all of software development. It's a good line, but I want to push back on it gently because I don't think we were blinking. The data was always there. The commits are public. The growth curve was charted in real time. People were watching. The question is what watching actually means when the thing you're looking at is changing faster than the frameworks you use to make sense of it. Here's what I find more interesting than the number itself. The transformation it represents was not hidden. SemiAnalysis published their analysis with full methodology. Boris Cherny's post went to 4 million people. Anthropic published their own internal research, a detailed, careful study of what Claude Code is doing to engineering work at the company that built it. This wasn't a leak or a projection. It was a structured survey of 132 engineers and researchers, supplemented by 53 in-depth interviews and internal usage data published openly. The findings are worth sitting with because they're more nuanced than the headline adoption numbers suggest. At the time of the study, Anthropic engineers reported using Claude in 60% of their work, with a self-reported 50% productivity boost, 2 to 3 times higher than the previous year. 27% of Claude-assisted work consisted of tasks that wouldn't have been attempted at all without it. Scaling projects that previously weren't cost-effective, exploratory work that would have been left undone, tools built because the marginal cost of building them had fallen far enough to justify it. But here is the detail that changes the shape of the story. Despite all of that, most engineers said they could fully delegate only 0 to 20% of their work to Claude. They maintain active supervision, especially on anything high stakes. They've developed careful intuitions for what to hand off. Tasks that are easily verifiable, low stakes, or, as one engineer put it, boring. The more excited they are about a task, the less likely they are to give it away. Anthropic's own researchers named this a trust progression. Engineers start with simple, contained tasks and expand the scope of delegation incrementally, testing the boundary as they go. Many are holding design decisions and taste judgments for themselves. For now, with that qualifier doing real work in the sentence. This is the part of the story I think gets lost when we talk about the 4% figure. That number lives at the aggregate level. The experience it represents lives at the individual level. And at the individual level, it looks much more like a careful, ongoing negotiation than a sudden handover. And that negotiation, that deliberate management of how much change to absorb at once, is not the same thing as ignorance or denial. It is, if anything, the rational response to a situation where the cost of getting the calibration wrong is high, and the only way to know how much to trust something is to test it incrementally against reality. Looking is hard not because people are avoiding what's in front of them. It's hard because the aggregate and the individual don't speak the same language. 1 in 25 is a fact that lives at a scale no individual developer experiences. What they experience is their own code base, their own judgment call about what to delegate today, their own assessment of whether the output of the last task was good enough to expand the scope of the next one. The number is always there to be counted. The meaning of the number has to be assembled from the inside, one decision at a time, and that takes bandwidth that is genuinely in short supply. There's a detail in the Anthropic internal research that captures this better than any statistic. Some engineers described worry, not about the capability of the tool, but about their own. They're getting more done, covering more ground, tackling a wider range of tasks. But some of them are quietly asking whether in delegating the execution, they might be eroding something harder to name. The ability to supervise outputs you no longer fully understand. The depth of knowledge that comes from having written the thing yourself. The question, still unresolved in the research, of what happens when the trust progression reaches its limit, and you're no longer sure where that limit is. That's not a person refusing to look at the number. That's a person looking at it very carefully, and finding that what they see raises more questions than it answers. When Claude Code submits a commit, who wrote that code? Boris Cherny's answer is clear. He did. He set the objective, reviewed the output, made the judgment calls about what was good enough and what needed iteration, and shipped the result. The authorship is his. The code is the expression of his intent, executed by a different kind of tool than the ones he used before. The SemiAnalysis analogy is useful here. They describe the ChatGPT API as Web 1.0, call and response, a token in and a token out, static. Claude Code, in their framing, is Web 2.0, orchestration, dynamic, agents managing larger sets of work with humans as architects rather than typists. The value, they argue, will be built on top of the protocol. In the applications, the workflows, the new categories of work that become possible when the cost of execution falls far enough, not in the protocol itself. That's a compelling frame, but it sits alongside something that I think is equally true and less tidy. The Slashdot thread that ran alongside the SemiAnalysis piece drew hundreds of comments from working developers, engineers, architects, engineering managers, and what it revealed was a profession in the middle of renegotiating something it hasn't fully named yet. One commenter described Claude Code as the first tool that made me feel like I was managing an engineer rather than using a tool. That shift, from tool to something that requires management, is where the actual change is happening, quietly, commit by commit. Managing an engineer is different from using a tool. It requires a different kind of attention, a different relationship to the output, a different answer to the question of where your judgment ends and the work begins. The skeptics in the thread pointed to a long history of predictions about the end of programming that didn't materialize. COBOL, Visual Basic, low-code platforms, each one supposed to make developers unnecessary, each one ultimately expanding the total amount of software in the world, and with it the demand for people who understood it. The argument is that this time will follow the same pattern. Cheaper execution means more software, more complexity, more need for the people who can navigate it. That argument has merit, but it also has a limit. Previous waves of automation in software development lowered the barrier to simple applications while leaving complex systems engineering largely untouched. What's different about Claude Code is that it operates at the level of the code base. Not just the line, not just the function, but the architecture, the dependencies, the multi-file refactor. The tasks it handles are not the ones that were already accessible to non-engineers. They're the ones that used to require someone who genuinely knew what they were doing. Whether that expands the pie or contracts the profession is genuinely unknown. What isn't unknown is that the definition of what a software engineer does is changing. And that change is documented, measurable, visible in the commit history of the world's largest code platform. 1 in 25, doubling monthly, and the engineers closest to it are proceeding carefully, extending trust incrementally, holding the design decisions for themselves, and asking quietly whether the skills they're not using are skills they're keeping or skills they're losing. The SemiAnalysis headline was "While you blinked," but I don't think that's quite right. The data was always there. The commits were always public. The research was published openly. Boris Cherny's post got 4 million views. If anything, we've been watching this very closely. And what we found is that watching closely doesn't resolve the difficulty of seeing clearly. 1 in 25 is not a crisis. It's not a vindication. It's a fact that exists at a scale no individual developer encounters in a day's work, which means that internalizing it, actually updating your sense of what a profession is, what authorship means, what it will take to stay oriented in work that is changing underneath you, requires something beyond paying attention. It requires the kind of sustained incremental reckoning that the Anthropic engineers described in their own research. A trust progression, applied not just to a tool, but to a new account of what the work actually is. That's hard. It's hard in the way that any genuine reckoning with change is hard. Not because the facts are hidden, but because the facts and the meaning aren't the same thing. And the distance between them has to be crossed by each person. From the inside, one decision at a time. By the end of this year, if the projections hold, it will be 1 in 5. That's all from us, Neil and Claude. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on Monday.